I feel like in general we don't talk about electric vehicle charging enough. There's way too much documentation on range, but not so much how DC fast charging really affects road trip time, mainly because everyone is still very much traditionally thinking of gas vehicles where you drive until it's close to empty and then you fill it up to full and then you keep going. But because batteries are just fundamentally different than a gas tank, a charging curve really does make a pretty substantial impact on your road trip experience, because if your charging curve tapers off very quickly, then a lot of the times you'll actually get to your destination faster by not charging to full and instead just stopping to charge more frequently. But of course, then all of the time it takes for you to get off the freeway, find the charger, plug in, hopefully the charger's online and working and has stalls available for you to pull into, all of these other variables start to increase your road trip time. What's interesting though about the Aptera is that despite them having very different range options between the battery pack sizes they plan on bringing to market, the charging curve is honestly what I think might be the most interesting differentiating feature between these different trims that probably hasn't been talked about very much. So in case you missed it, the Aptera Launch Edition is just targeting about 50 kilowatts of DC fast charging speed, potentially more once they start testing and calibrating their power delivery unit. But the reason Aptera was okay settling with such a traditionally low charging speed was because their vehicle is so efficient and its battery pack is so small that 50 kilowatts actually translates to about 500 miles an hour. And I asked the CEO about this, if the decision to keep the peak speed somewhat low has any kind of cost and efficiency advantages, and of course the answer was yes. That's a big reason the Chevy Bolt, which was so much more affordable than most other electric vehicles with an over 200 mile range, capped out at about 50 kilowatts, because they didn't have to try that hard to cool down the battery pack and get rid of all of that excess heat that is generated by traditional EV batteries that charge at, 150 or over 200 kilowatts. Yeah, most cells have a C rating that goes between 2 to 4 Cs. In other words, like a 40 kilowatt hour pack could probably comfortably take 120 kilowatts, but you have to come up with a safe and reliable way to displace a lot of that heat. So sometimes there's more liquid cooling involved, or you just have to have beefier battery management systems, and that of course results in more energy loss, and Aptera wanted to avoid that. And of course, to get to market quicker, they wanted a cheaper fast charging system. And since the Aptera is so efficient and gets 10 miles per kilowatt hour, 50 kilowatts translates to about 500 miles per hour. But what's going to be really interesting, that I hope Aptera dives into in a future update video, because their first production intent battery packs should be arriving here in the US within a couple of weeks, is what the charging curve on the Launch Edition looks like. I know this isn't an exact science because the cell chemistries are very different and everything, but because I would say the charging system in the Aptera is probably closer to that of a Chevy Bolt, which is, not maxing out the C rating of the pack, but more relying on a traditional passively cooled fast charging system that caps out at about 50 kilowatts. If you go look up the charging curve characteristics of the Chevy Bolt, it takes a couple minutes for it to get up to 50 kilowatts, but it tends to hold it pretty deep into the pack, relatively speaking to other EVs out there. So the Chevy Bolt, I noticed personally in the charging tests I watched, start tapering off at about 50%. That's when it starts making its way down to 40 kilowatts and then 30 kilowatts. But if you compare that to pretty much any Tesla, which is kind of like the traditional gold standard for electric vehicles these days, like my car, for example, Model 3 rear-wheel drive with a lithium iron phosphate battery pack. If I, precondition for a good while before I get to the charger and I plug in at a low state of charge, I can hit my peak speed of about 170 kilowatts, but it does not stay there very long. I've timed it many times, by the way, and it usually peaks at 170 kilowatts and stays above 150 for about 60 seconds. And then after another 2 or 3 minutes, it's now down to 120 kilowatts, and by the time I get to 50%, I'm usually sitting at about 100 kilowatts, which is not bad by any means, but it translates to a miles per hour of around 450 to 500, so really not all that different from what the Aptera should achieve. But keep in mind that Launch Edition Aptera has a 400 plus mile range. So if the charging characteristics of the Launch Edition end up being even somewhat similar to the Chevy Bolt, and by the way, it could be a little bit worse and still be quite impressive, because if they can maintain that 50 kilowatt peak speed fairly deep into the pack, then that means over the course of just 10 minutes you could add over 100 miles of range back into the battery pack, and by 20 minutes probably have enough range to continue driving and reach another DC fast charger if you want, want, or again, you can top off if you want to end up at your destination with a little bit of buffer. But thankfully, it's got the solar charging as well, so Aptera should be pretty good at keeping itself charged at your destination anyway. But an even more exciting development that I think could revolutionize the EV industry, or at least shed a lot more light on Aptera than is currently shined, is what Chris Anthony briefly talked about in our last interview. The CEO of Aptera straight up told me that by the time they bring the 600 and 1,000 mile range variants onto the market, they fully expect to beef up their power delivery system so that it can accept much higher peak currents. And I suggested that Aptera could have class-leading charging speed just by getting to 150 kilowatts, which again, relatively speaking to the rest of the EV industry, is not that crazy. And on that 1,000 mile range variant that I have on order, that's going to have a 100 kilowatt hour battery pack. So if you could hit the traditional 3C rating on that pack, you're talking 300-ish kilowatts. And that's the number that Chris Anthony responded with when he talked about Tesla slowly opening up their supercharger network. The new V4s, he's expecting to be able to output that amount of power to not just Tesla's vehicles, but to non-Teslas as well. So I don't know if that's him confirming anything for those higher range options, but if Aptera is able to get anywhere close to that, let's just assume they peak out at about 200 kilowatts for this super long range variant, assuming they're still able to get close to 10 miles per kilowatt hour with their aerodynamic design and lightweight composite body structure that even a weak guy like me is capable of picking up, that means that we're talking about an electric vehicle that could go close to 1,000 miles on a charge while simultaneously peak charging at like 2,000 miles per hour. Okay, best case scenario, if we round up a little bit and they are able to hit 300 kilowatts, not sure how long they're going to be able to maintain that speed going into the battery pack, but at 300 kilowatts, we're talking 3,000 miles per hour, and the fastest charging EVs on the market right now, like a long-range Tesla or a Lucid Air, which can peak at like 350 kilowatts, that peaks out at like 1,200 or 1,300 miles per hour, which means that in a perfect world where you have this high-range Aptera and you're able to plug into a V4 supercharger capable of outputting that kind of speed, within 10 minutes of charging, you could add back 250 miles of range, or depending on how long they maintain that speed, possibly more, and you're actually reaching a point where an electric vehicle could get enough range added back into the battery pack that it would be close to the equivalent amount of time that it would take to fill up a gas tank on a gas vehicle. And to me, that's pretty insanely nutty, because we've had to do so many verbal gymnastics in the EV community to try to justify the fact that EVs don't necessarily charge as fast as a gas car can be filled up. We have to say, oh, well, you know, some people, they like to stop longer at the charger. They like to go to the bathroom, get a snack. It's okay if it takes a little bit longer, or you mainly plug in from home anyway, so you don't need to worry about how long the DC fast charging stations take. But I feel like this cannonball record breaker Aptera that they're theoretically going to be able to build after, of course, they bring the launch edition and the more cheaper variants to market, this thing is going to kind of rethink what an electric vehicle can be and show the world that electric vehicles have the capacity to be the better car in pretty much every way. Even the best range gas cars these days that are super efficient hybrids with massive gas tanks, most of them don't exceed 700 to 800 miles, whereas with the Aptera, we're talking about something that goes close to 1,000, depending on, of course, the weather and wind speed and how fast you're traveling and all that. But you'd have to basically compare it to like a big Ram pickup truck with a huge gas tank, or, you know, a diesel-powered semi-truck with huge fuel reserves in order to get the kind of range to mass this type of EV. And that's why I'm personally glad that they haven't backed down from their claims about this high-range model. I know a lot of people out there are like, no one needs that kind of range, that's just way too much. Most people are going to be fine with 400 miles of range, and a lot of people honestly would probably be fine with the entry price, you know, $26,000 Aptera with 250 miles of range. And I agree, for the masses that will be totally fine. And right now Aptera claims that most of their reservations are for the 400 mile range variant, but long term, I think with adequate charging infrastructure, most people are probably going to end up going with the cheapest Aptera that's going to be around 26 grand. But in the same way that Tesla wants to build the Roadster or have the Plaid Model S or X, not everybody needs that kind of performance, but they want to build those cars anyway, just to be the ultimate smackdown to the combustion engine, to prove to everybody what EVs are capable of. And I think that's kind of what the Aptera 1,000 mile variant can be. It's more of like an ultimate smackdown to the combustion engine, prove what electric vehicles can do. And while the range is how we all recognize and identify that particular regular variant as the one with 100 kilowatt hours, I also think the charging speed and the charging characteristics of that model are really going to shatter all other EV records. Like, no other EV is going to come close to that one in regards to miles per hour added back into the pack, and I really can't wait to do testing videos on it. But honestly, I think that because it has such a high range and it's capable of charging itself up with sunlight, there's probably going to be very few times you ever need to plug it in, because assuming that you drive that variant of the Aptera at like speed limit speeds over the course of a day, it would still take you 12 plus or 14 plus hours to actually drain the battery pack completely from full. After 14 hours of driving, you're probably ready to go to sleep anyway. But there's certainly a lot of use cases for it out there. I know it only has the 2 seats, but if you're traveling around with kids, trust me, you definitely don't want to go for 12 hours nonstop. The kind of people that are driving for 12 or 14 hours nonstop are probably going to be traveling salesmen or guys who live on the road, which I have friends that drive like that, where they have to work for a business that has a lot of locations, and they have to drive to all of these locations to check up on management or do maintenance. Service technicians, you know, guys that put a lot of miles on their vehicles. Having all of that storage space in the back, but also being able to just drive for hours and hours a day, quickly get to their customers and get back home in time for dinner, and not have to worry about how long the charging station stop is going to take you, or how long the gas station stop is going to take you, because that's probably what they're used to right now. So there's a lot of business operations for single guys or just a couple of guys that I think the Aptera might actually be perfect for. Just moving people around super affordably, super cost effectively, and while simultaneously using a fraction of the energy that it would take any other vehicle. You know, regardless of how many times you would have to stop and charge your car, the Aptera is targeting, again, around 100 kilowatt hours to get you 1,000 miles. Just picture that in any other vehicle, right? If you wanted to take a Cybertruck 1,000 miles, of course you're going to be stopping and charging a lot more often, but it's also going to take you more like 300 kilowatt hours instead of 100 kilowatt hours, and you're still going to have to stop and charge for that. The Aptera, probably you can top off using home electricity prices, whereas the Cybertruck's going to be dependent on more supercharger prices as you go, which means that not only would the Aptera get to your destination faster because there's less stops, but it would also get you there for a third the price of electricity. Saves you money the longer you drive it, and of course the upfront price of the Aptera would be far less than that of a Cybertruck as well. So please, let's talk more about chargers and charging infrastructure and charging curves, because that's going to make a big impact in the transition to electrification. What do you guys think of Aptera's choices with their peak speeds? Feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and thank you to everybody supporting this channel directly. Seriously, helps us out a ton, as does just watching these videos, so thanks again. Have an excellent rest of your day.